And hello, welcome everyone to All About Music's second digital session. Just to reiterate for those of you who don't know about All About Music, since you've been fast asleep for the last 3 years, All About Music is India's most inclusive music conference. It is really the industry conference for all stakeholders of the music industry. So, welcome everyone. We are looking to hold the main event on August 18 and 19, all things going well. But in the meantime, we have started our digital sessions because a lot of you have wanted to know and talk about various issues which you can't always attend at the main conference. So today, last week actually, we picked up on something that was a lot of, it was the subject of a lot of debate because it was around cover versions and what artists need to do to release cover versions legitimately, because a lot of people are sitting at home today and recording covers which they want to put out. So that was relevant. And now as we gear towards easing of lockdowns across the world, the burning question is what happens to the music industry globally and what can we expect in India? So we thought that this was an opportune moment to get some very wise people in to talk about what we think is going to happen, what they think is going to happen, and to look into a crystal ball and see a little into the future post this COVID-19 pandemic. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you somebody who's very well versed with the music industry because he cut his chops in the music business, from starting a record label which went on to become very famous to holding several positions in the industry. And then when the digital business came in, he was a mover and shaker for music in the digital world. And of course, he's our favorite moderator. We call him Moderator Emeritus because that's a position he's always going to hold in our hearts. We love the man. He's as Indian as Vada Pav. Please welcome Mr. Ralph Simon. Sorry, Ralph, can't hear you. I think
there we are.
There we are.
Here we are.
There we are.
Namaste. Thank you so much, Atul. You make me feel amazing, and certainly widecasting to an Indian audience. India, I love India. I'm Indian inside and Indian outside, and certainly this is a great opportunity. We have a great session today in the All About Music digital sessions because today we're really looking at what we can do to enhance Indian music, the Indian music industry, the live Indian industry, live entertainment, and a whole range of other things. And of course, music plays such an important role, and particularly now as we're in the Janta curfew and people being locked in and at home, very difficult. But music obviously plays an important part. You know, Atul, I just learned in New York, every evening at 7 p.m., they get all the people in Manhattan to hear the song New York, New York, as an anthem to get people's spirits up. And who knows whether this might be the case with maybe some great music by Arijit Singh or maybe some other great Indian artist that gets people's spirits going. But today, Atul, we've got somebody who we think will be very insightful and helpful to our audience. And just to give you a little bit of background of who we have today, his name is Will Page. And Will is originally from Scotland. He's a great Scotsman, but he lives in London. And Will was, until just a couple of months ago, the chief economist at Spotify for 7 years. Before that, he was the chief economist for PRS for Music, the Performing Rights Society for Music in the UK, looking worldwide. And he was responsible for publishing some pioneering work, adding up the industry, the long tail, particularly important paper on Radiohead and Radiohead's In Rainbows, where he asked about whether legal free could compete with illegal free using economic and statistical arguments. And he had a pivotal role in solving the BBC's BBC 6 music station. When he joined Spotify in 2012, he looked at what made a hit, the anatomy of a hit. Like, for example, Meghan Trainor, Lord, who had that great hit with Royals, Mr. Probes, a well-known rapper, and his annual calculation of the global value of music copyright. Very important. And it became an essential tool for the music industry stakeholders, and asking whether the definition of catalog needed an upgrade in today's modern times. He's been instrumental in helping the industry stakeholders adapt to streaming and to let go of outdated, old-style music concepts. And his most recent collaboration has been with the University of Chicago in behavioral economics, and particularly looking at one of Spotify's most important elements, Discover Weekly, which comes out every Monday, giving Spotify subscribers an idea of what might be in their audio interest to listen to. He's a visiting fellow of the London School of Economics. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in London. And he is somebody who is a passionate communicator, regularly featured in The Economist, in the Financial Times, Music Week, in the Daily Telegraph. Also, he might be an economist, but he comes from the background of writing for Straight No Chaser, very hip fanzine, and also is a chart-topping DJ, doing DJ sets of West African high-life music. So we'd like to welcome, great pleasure to welcome, and we thought we'd start off, Atul, with a little bit of Scottish Punjabi music just before we introduce him. So before we bring Will Page onto the screen, let us go to a great Indian artist called Snake Charmer, who lives in Delhi. But this, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls watching this, here is some special Punjabi music to set the tone for Will Page. Let's go to the video. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome to the All About Music digital session, the one and only Will Page. Will, unmute your mic, Will.
Welcome, Will.
There you go.
It's a
Thank
pleasure
you.
to have you. It's an honor to have you. And, I'd only ever heard of economists like Adam Smith and Karl Marx when we were studying economics in college. I never actually thought I'd have the privilege of meeting one, and especially in the music business. So it's as much a surprise as an honor. So thank you very much for doing this for All About Music.
Thank you very much. Very, very grateful to be here.
And Will, the clip that we played was a song called Drowsy Molly, which is an old Scottish song, but we thought we'd have to pay homage to you coming from Scotland to have the first time ever on All About Music, a Punjabi Scottish music artist.
It's fantastic. And I can only hope to reciprocate should I be able to visit Mumbai later this year and bring a good crate of Scottish Speyside Sherry Cask whiskey for all the attendees for this conference. So very grateful for that introduction.
Recorded, Will. That's been recorded.
I'll bring the good stuff, the stuff that we don't sell in English. I'll bring that stuff over for you guys.
So, Will, you're in London, and this is where you're now working from. So you're speaking to us from London. Atul is in Mumbai. We're also in London, and we're broadcasting to all over the world because we've got people watching in Australia, in the United States, even though it's still 4 a.m. in the morning in Los Angeles. But we are also speaking to people in the Nordics, Scandinavia, Europe. So All About Music is penetrating worldwide. And Will, we've got a number of key questions we'd like to speak to you about. We'll let's get cracking right away. You ready to rock, Will?
Absolutely, ready to roll.
Okay, ready to roll. So, number one, streaming has clearly become one of the most important issues in global music, and in the way that creators, writers, artists, producers, record labels, music publishers are dealing with the modern form of music. And All About Music has always liked to look around corners and see what's coming next, particularly for the Indian industry and for Indian music professionals. So looking back 5 years, what have been the most notable trends in streaming to affect the global market and India specifically? And then give us your sense of what you see over the course of the next 5 years, what you see as being emerging trends for the Indian industry.
Great. Well, great first question there, Ralph. I would look at it this way. I think getting some context on how far we've come and how far we still have to go is really important for your audience here. Let me just say one thing first of all. Daniel often talked about the competition for eyes versus the competition for ears. And pardon me?
You said Daniel who?
Daniel Ek, our founder of Spotify. And I just thought it's very interesting how you looked at the demand for eyeball content versus the demand for earhole content, you could call it. And we have maybe just short of 1 billion people around the world willing to pay for television. And on Monday, which makes this whole event so timely, we're going to learn that there's just over 330 million people paying for music around the world. So we've come a long way, a business that's growing, but we're still just 1/3 of the journey in to match what the television business has achieved. I think that's really important. Secondly, I think it's worth noting that the business is a lot bigger than it was. And a recent piece of work, which we can circulate to all the attendees on the global value of copyright, would argue that the business today of music copyright, that is labels, publishers, collecting societies, all put together, is now bigger than it's ever been in the past. Now, when I first met you, Ralph, back in 2007, we never thought we'd be writing headlines like that because the business was looking into an abyss. So take stock of just how far we've come and how far we still have to go is the key message I want to get across. Now, I want to bring it down to an Indian-specific perspective. If we were to learn that there was 330 odd million subscribers around the world, let's just remember that Jio, the telco here in India, has 370 million subscribers. And that gives you an idea of scale. And whereas bundling streaming services with telcos was a big thing in the past in the established markets, I think how the streaming services work with telcos in India will be a big thing of the future in the Indian-specific markets. So we're going to see that shift from how did streaming get going back in 2011-12? You saw Spotify work with Telia, with KPN in Holland, with all these different telcos. That's now considered past tense. Whereas for India, when you have Jio with 370 million subscribers, that's very much going to be the future. So it'll be interesting to see how the 9, 10, 11 big players in India partner with these telcos, a David and Goliath relationship, if you like. Ralph.
So here's the thing, and Atul, if you can just help clarify this. If we look at the major players in India at the moment, we have Jio, which obviously is an online broadband player, and they also were the company that acquired Savan, South Asian Audiovisual Network, which is now part of their music offering. We have Hungama and their Artists Allowed, important. We have YouTube Music. We have Resso, Amazon Prime Music, Apple Music, Wink and Spotify, and of course Ghana, which is part of the Times Group. Anyone else that we've missed there, Atul?
No, I think we've covered all of them. I mean, it's confusing to us as to whether we have about 9 major players streaming music. Is that an excessive number? Is that a decent number? You know, how do you see it operating in developed markets?
It's going to be a fascinating question because you're right. You know, most countries you'd have 4 or 5 big players. So Amazon, Apple, YouTube, Spotify, and maybe a few others along the way. Whereas India, you have a lot more, but of course it's a much larger country. I would expect some sort of merger and acquisition activity further down the line, but India should be able to accommodate more players than you would see in a typical market as well. Very interesting to think about how those players could adapt to the language barrier in India in terms of one player curating for one particular community and another player curating for another particular community. So you're going to have that distinction as well. So I could envisage some mergers and acquisitions happening to bring the number down a bit, but then again, there's no precedent compared to the opportunity that exists in India. So I could see those 11 players even growing to more as well.
So, Will, here's a question for you. We heard a couple of days ago when Daniel Ek, the Spotify co-founder, was giving his earnings report to Wall Street and to the financial community that Spotify now on a worldwide basis has got 286 million users, 5% increase from the last 3 months. 130 million of whom now pay roughly around, I would say it would be about 200 rupees a month. But the question is, in terms of streaming, when we look at some of the other bigger players, is Spotify the largest streaming platform in the world?
In the world, it's out there up front in terms of people paying for the service. But again, to give you an idea of what makes India so unique, so fascinating for me as an economist, is if we go back, let's say a year or so, YouTube made an announcement. Data costs in India obviously fell. YouTube exploded, and they said they had 240 million people using music on YouTube in India. 240 million. At that point, Spotify's global reach was 230 million. So in 1 year and in one country, YouTube had reached more people than Spotify had done in 13 years of blood, sweat, and tears. And that, again, just gives you an idea of, yes, there are global leaders, but India is different. So we just have to keep in mind what it means when 250 million people are using YouTube to get music now.
So what you're saying is that video music is as important as audio music. Well, they're kind of neck and neck, really. But the point is, for Indian audiences who are used to the video benefits of years and years of Bollywood film and television material, video music and audio music are equally important in the Indian context.
Yeah, and if I can just give a suggestion to the audience here of what I think could really accelerate the Indian music industry and its Bollywood industry as well. I'm always fascinated with what Amazon have done with IMDb. So Amazon needs no introduction. IMDb stands for the Internet Movie Database, a rich source of everything you could possibly want to know about movies. And Amazon acquired it. So now when you watch an Amazon movie on your sofa or on a smart TV, and if you press pause, it'll first tell you who the actors are and also tell you what music is playing. A great way of eliminating friction. I remember that actor, I just can't remember their name. Press pause, it tells you. I remember that song, I just can't remember the name of the song. Press pause, it tells you. The person who invented that, an Indian expat working in Seattle, actually, he has 3 words in his office: friction, kill it. So what Amazon has done there is that they've removed the friction, kill it. So when you have friction in life, if Amazon can kill that friction, they can find value. So they've enriched the movie experience by integrating IMDb. Now, if you think about the Indian music industry, and I've studied like crazy ahead of this seminar that we're doing here, the integration between movie and film, it'd be very interesting to have an Indian IMDb play by one of the streaming services that could bring the rich level of content from the movie industry into the musical experience. That, for me, could be a potential game changer.
Well, Atul, what do you think of that?
Well, I think it's been a challenge to get data in India, and if someone took the initiative that Will is talking about, I think it would be definitely doable, and it would be very necessary, especially given the different languages that we have, which run across different scripts. So it's not all in the Roman Catholic script. So you have to have I think it's a question of investment. If someone invests in putting this together, it could be done, and it would be extremely useful. So that's a very, very good tip. I'm sure there's some business people sitting over there scribbling notes furiously.
Maybe there's someone in Bengaluru or someone in Hyderabad that sees this as an interesting new innovation invitation. But maybe someone in Mumbai, someone in Delhi, someone in Bihar. You never know where that might happen in India. One question for you, Atul. Is this an accurate statement that about 40% of music and music purchase, listening, and so forth is non-Bollywood today in India? Is that the number, roughly speaking?
Yes, that's right. So it's a number between 30 and 40%, where there's a lot of non-film music being listened to, and we have to remember that we have some very, very strong categories of music outside of Bollywood. Our devotional music is very, very large, and it's the second largest category after Bollywood. We have Indian classical music that we have exported to the rest of the world, and we will talk to Will about those opportunities as we go along. But Indian classical music has a very, very solid base. It doesn't sound very large, and don't forget, international music is very popular in India as well.
So, for example, ghazals. I know that Hungama have a lot of success with ghazal music, and some of the great stars of ghazal music are very, very popular, as popular as maybe some of the pop stars.
Definitely. And, you know, we had Jagjit Singh, who was one of the greatest ghazal singers we produced. And his songs, without the benefit of a movie, have become as big, if not bigger, than a lot of Bollywood songs.
Incredible. Amazing. So, Will, just from a streaming point of view on a global basis now, if it wasn't for streaming, the future of the music industry would not be as rosy as it is now, with record labels really seeing the benefit of their catalogs bringing newfound revenues because of streaming.
Yeah, so this is a really important point. Let me begin by making just a very basic observation, which often gets lost. There's far more smartphones in existence today than there ever were CD players back at the turn of the millennium. So what the music industry has done is they've swung from an old vine of ownership, which required a CD player to enrich the value of music, to a new vine of access, which can work on smartphones. And you as a telco expert, Ralph, knows this more than anyone. But that's very important when people have nostalgia about the way the industry used to work. I just argue against that nostalgia and think about the sheer scale of potential of the way it could work. And then to your point about catalog, it's a very interesting point for the audience to consider here. So let's just use a catchphrase here of, I preferred the earlier stuff. Ralph releases an album. It's a great album. I'm a huge fan of Ralph Simon, which one it is. Ralph Simon's music. But I preferred his earlier stuff. Now, when that happened with CDs or downloads, nobody knew what was happening. They didn't know that I preferred the earlier stuff. They just knew that I purchased a new album. Now with streaming, when a new album comes out and I prefer the earlier stuff, that streaming we don't just know about, but we monetize again and again and again. And that's just a very interesting opportunity in terms of music catalog now, which is now being enriched and monetized, which may have been dormant for 20, 30 years. So it's a very interesting time when we think about what happens to the older content that sits on streaming platforms.
So let's move on to the modern day problems or challenges, really, and looking at the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on music.
Yes.
It caused much of the music world, certainly the live entertainment world, to literally stop. So, Will, how does an economist like you even try to begin to gauge the impact of this unprecedented event on music and media globally and in India? When the dust settles, what kind of world do we return to? And what are you seeing in terms of changing patterns? For example, are people listening to more music, streaming more music, certain kinds of music? What's your take on it as an economist and looking at the anatomy of music?
Great. So I've got this one locked into 2 points. The first is to think about the music business, and the second is to think about the attention business. And this is really important. We have to spin both plates in our heads here. So in the music industry, what I see is the relative stability of streaming, particularly paid streaming, and then the instability of live. So in terms of the streaming business, there are some people with knee-jerk reactions to things going up or down. Broadly speaking, it's steady as a rock. Nobody is churning. Nobody is unsubscribing. It is a stay-at-home safe stock, if you want to call it. Whereas the live business is literally staring into the abyss now. And that raises all sorts of issues. And I'd ask you guys to think about the spillover effects of a lack of a live touring market back onto the streaming business. That's going to be important. What does that mean for how consumers are consuming? Perhaps Taylor Swift should be on the road just now making gazillions of dollars with her global tour. She isn't. Are her streaming numbers the same as before? Maybe yes, maybe no. Is the type of content they're streaming the same as before? Maybe they're streaming more catalog and less of the new record because there's no tour to promote the new record. So it's dynamics like that which I think are really relevant between live and recorded. Equally, we should not forget the most important question, which is artist income. And credit to many of the streaming companies for having ideas to get aid, to get funding, to get donations back out to artists as well. If we just apply an 80-20 rule, if 80% of an artist's livelihood comes from touring and 20% is from streaming, well, 80% of that 80% has now disappeared. So it's interesting to see the different ways that streaming companies have tried to help artists get through that. So that's the key thing on what happens within music: the stability of live and the stability of streaming and the instability of live. Now I want to switch it and talk about attention, because this is the big one for me. If you look across media, we're all competing for attention, and attention is scarce. As Herbert Simon said, we have a wealth of information and a poverty of attention. Something has to give. And what's clear to me is that music has done okay. Netflix has done pretty well, but the gaming industry is going through the roof. And that's
You're
very...
talking about video games and esports, right?
Yes, yes. That has been the clear winner of the crisis. Let's just put a stat to kind of wake us up here on this point, which is in the month of March, $10.8 billion of turnover was done by the gaming industry in 1 month. That's more than than global paid streaming will generate in this calendar year. 1 month versus 1 year. So you can see who the winner is, and they're winning attention. So then the question becomes, how, when the dust settles, as your question asked, will music win that attention back? And that's a great one to get into with your audience, which is, do games take 3 steps forward and 1 step back, or do they take 3 steps forward and no steps back when the dust settles? But it's clear to me that gaming is the winner. It's given you social interaction, and it's given you entertainment, 2 for the price of 1, and they are cleaning up at the moment. So that's the big challenge there. So just to recap, what happens when the collapse of live feeds into streaming, which is stable, and what happens when all that attention we've lost to gaming has to kind of migrate its way back to music?
So Atul, here's a question for you. If we're looking at this, basically a close down of live entertainment, companies, wonderful Indian companies like Only Much Louder or even Book My Show, suddenly finding that they don't have product to work with as such, and Live Nation, the big international company that brought Justin Bieber to India, have had to cancel 8,000 concerts. What's your take on the current situation with live in India, and what are some of the important promoters having to do to deal with this incredible problem?
Ralph, the first obvious thing was to try and get digital concerts in. So, there has been a lot of activity there. I think we'll need a little more time to figure how those numbers stack up in terms of both viewerships and in terms of revenue, because everything, people assume that it's all free. It hasn't been. And I think there have been cases of people charging for concerts. So I think it's as Scott Cohen put it the other day. He said perhaps this is a Napster moment when innovation will actually be born out of adversity that we are facing now. So I think it's going to lead to innovation for sure. It's going to throw up a lot of ideas with artists about opportunities of what can be done, even if things were to go back to normal. So I think in some way there is going to be a benefit that comes out of this.
But clearly, for the moment, the live industry has had to rely on online, like we saw last weekend, where there was this global event that was curated by Lady Gaga that got about 30 million people watching around the world. But from an Indian perspective, if people are stuck at home, if they want to go and see, as an example, Arijit Singh and his incredible band and incredible show, they just can't do it for the time being. They'd have to rely on some kind of online connectivity.
Yes, and last week we had YouTube also come up with the One World thing, which was streaming live on that platform, and you had a variety of Indian artists performing there as well. So I think these things are starting to gain a lot of attention. I think the business models need to be worked out, and I think we need to stop asking artists to perform for free, because this is going to be the new normal.
Yeah, if I could just chime in there very quickly, I think the words for me are accelerating change. So what this crisis is doing is it's accelerating change. Here in London, some people used online shopping, other people went to the high street. This is going to accelerate change. More people will use online shopping, less people will go to the high street. And I just worked on a Financial Times piece recently, which is about the book that I'm writing at the moment, how everybody's got a Napster moment to deal with at the moment. And it's just worth thinking about video conferencing. The market capitalization, the market value of Zoom, the video conferencing tool, is now worth more than any US airline. Think about that for a second. Did anyone know what Zoom was back in January? Now it's worth more than any US airline. In fact, I'd go further and say it's worth more than every US airline combined. So just think about how that's accelerating change that was already taking place. Video conferencing was present, but it's been accelerated as a result of the crisis.
You know, Will, you'd mentioned about the importance of telcos. Of course, the big Chinese phone manufacturer Xiaomi is now apparently the largest selling smartphone in India, and they've taken upon themselves to make sure that they have music well featured on their platform. I think Ungama is one of the primary suppliers to them. But here's a question from Hiren Kangad, one of our viewing, listening audience, who says, how far are we from the time when people will start paying to watch live streams? What do you make of that? Atul? Will?
Well,
So for myself, I think it's going to happen sooner rather than later. I think what you're beginning to see now is, if we go back a few years, we had the Kickstarter model, where there was a kind of donation model to fund projects. That evolved into the Patreon model, which is much more about membership, funding somebody over a direct debit scheme. So whenever Atul produces something new, he can take £5 out of my account. And the direction of travel that you see there is going from one-off events to continuous support. And I think the opportunity to monetize video streaming will evolve out of that. So you'll see people using many different facilities, not just Zoom, to produce events, but using models such as the Patreon model. I'm not saying Patreon is the only company there, but just membership models to support them when they happen. So it's the recurring payment model that gives the artists the security that they can make a living out of this, and the fan the knowledge that they can support this directly, I think is going to produce that.
Atul, any further thoughts from you?
I've always been a champion for good quality, Ralph. So I think the artists who innovate quickly and are able to deliver quality in the performances that they're offering digitally are the ones who are going to be able to start charging faster than the others.
Okay, let's go to the next issue. I think we've covered some of those key things just in terms of what the impact of the crisis is and where it might lead us. Will, here's something for you. The challenges that are facing artists, composers, creators. It's 20 years on since the launch of Napster. Streaming still comes under a lot of criticism. The value of the stream, the transparency to artists. Are artists getting enough data to be able to show what of their music is working? The devaluation of music. And you know these issues better than anyone else. What is your response to the challenges facing artists and creators?
Yeah, so education was Tony Blair's mantra, and that's been my mantra with regards to helping people understand streaming. And I pray that I can come out to Mumbai later this year and do more of that with you guys directly. But just to recap, I think the macro and the micro arguments for streaming about why this needs to work, by why artists, labels, publishers, songwriters need to get behind this model, for me are very simple. The macro argument is the average revenue per music buyer. Not many people were buying music to own, and the average spend per year was not a lot of money. Remember, that was for ownership. There's far more smartphones than there ever were CD players. Now you can scale ARPU on a much wider scale. More people spending on average more money on copyright content. And the micro argument often is confusion about the value of a stream. It's just a very quick bit of arithmetic for this. But let's say somebody here in the UK is upset because they're getting half a penny per stream. That's half a penny per one person listening to one song. Maybe they say, when my song gets played on British radio, I get £40 per play. But that's 6 million people listening to one song. So divide the £40 by the 6 million audience, and you'll get your per stream, which will be a lot less than streaming. So it's just those 2 points. Average revenue per user, more people are spending more money on streaming. And back to the per stream on the micro level, the value of the stream is justifiable when you compare it properly to other forms of exploitation. That little bit of arithmetic is essential. I think the biggest challenge in India, and I've seen this in other countries as well, is price. As an economist, you'd expect me to talk about price. But how do you get the price right? What is the price that's going to scale? And I developed a formula for this, which I called the PCP formula, the Page Comparative Pricing Formula. I was really proud of that because I got to put my surname into a formula and also name it after the most violent drug ever to reach America, Angel Dust PCP. So it was a double whammy. But what that said was, take a look at what works in one country and look at disposable income and relative pricing and apply that to another country. Now, have we got a clear example of paid streaming working in South Asia? Not entirely convinced, but once we have one, we'll have a signal about where that can be transferred to other markets. But one other important aspect there is to think about family plan. If you look at Spotify's success in Latin America, the fastest growing region on planet Earth for 5 straight years now, it's huge, it's growing really fast, and family plan is really present. Now, a non-economist might say, in one sentence, we have this amazing success story in Latin America, and another success sentence say we have this huge problem with the family plan. My point is to read across the columns, not down them. Maybe family plan is what gave you the market clearing price, which allowed you to scale. Maybe gender and financial inclusion is an issue, which means that some people are more dependent on the family plan than others. So it's very interesting to think about what is a user, what is a subscriber, what is the device holder in India, and who's going to pay. Personal belief is to think about households, perhaps more often than not. People live in households. How do you monetize the household? Last point before handing over is just from challenges to potential. I would say that of the population of India, 500 million today are addressable, just to keep it to a nice round number. As you've already heard, YouTube Music has 250 million already on its system. What I think is really interesting is the growth of the addressable market in India. So we get the macroeconomics right, we can get the microeconomics right, and if we can get the price right, how much is this addressable market going to grow? And by my calculations, it's going to grow by 100 million people every 2 years, which is just jaw-dropping in terms of that potential. That's 100 million people who are A, financially inclusive, and B, have a smartphone that can accommodate music streaming. So when you have that growth in the addressable market, then the challenge facing India becomes really exciting as well. So a lot of economic tools and concepts to get your head around there, but get the macro and the micro picture right, get the price right, and the addressable market means you've got even more opportunity tomorrow than you do have today. Back to you, Alf.
So in terms of priority, sorry, Raf, in terms of priority, Will, would you say that first get the numbers in and then get the price right?
Yeah, I think of it as a funnel. Getting people into that free funnel that YouTube has, that Spotify has, is going to be critical in the early stages. And once there, you're able to look at conversion strategies. So I want to stress, A, it's going to be a learning exercise. Nobody knows. There's no textbook on the shelf saying, here's how to price legal music in India. This is a crapshoot. This is guesswork. And you learn by doing. You look at Latin America, nobody would have predicted that would have happened 5 years ago, but it did. And you can learn lessons from that as well. But then going back to an earlier point I mentioned, which is if the telcos are involved, what you learn there is that there is no price. People are willing to pay for telco communication, but they're not willing to pay for music. So can a deal be done there, which allows paid music to scale? My favorite example of a telco deal is Holland, the Netherlands, when Spotify partnered with KPN. Not just did KPN grow their subscriber base, but the organic subscribers grew with it. A rising tide lifts all boats. And the Dutch music industry went from falling off a cliff to one of the best performers in the whole of Europe. What I love about the Dutch story, though, is how do you beat piracy at its own game? The country with the most relaxed copyright laws in the world was Holland. Piracy wasn't even illegal. Very important point for the Indian audience to appreciate. Cannabis and copyright laws were broadly the same. You could do whatever you wanted, which can be a good thing. But because, go back to Daniel Ek's original vision in 2006, if you build something that's better than piracy, build something that's better than stealing, people will come. One of the first countries outside of Scandinavia that Spotify succeeded in was a country where piracy wasn't even illegal. And that shows you just strange things can happen on this journey, but you have to capitalize on them. And credit to Spotify, credit to KPN for making it happen. So, back to that point about when the telcos, the David and the Goliath relationship, when Goliath says, I want to move into this market and hide the price, then your economic brain has to think about, well, where is the price that we're paying for music versus the price that we're paying for communication? One last point, if I may, there as well, is back to the team at Spotify over in India, Akshay and his whole team. They taught me a wonderful lesson when I was learning about that country, which is the willingness to pay for music could be quite low because music has, and always will be, voluntary to pay for. I could stop my Spotify subscription today and listen to the radio for the rest of my life, and I'll get great music. But the willingness to pay for education is really high. And the student population of India is incredibly large. I always remember my colleague Akshat telling me that the student population of India is either 100 million or 200 million. For somebody who deals with standard deviation and variance, I always love that answer. So again, bundling music into telcos has been a tried and tested formula and had a lot of success. Bundling music into education could be a new avenue for India to explore as well. I'm not willing to pay for a streaming service, but I am willing to pay half of my disposable income on my child's education. Well, how about rolling it into education and seeing if the business can scale there? So there's a debate about price, but there's also a debate about hiding price into something else that people are willing to pay for.
And that's a good point that you've raised there, Will, because we'll talk about education in Sweden, which might be an example for Indian business people, professionals, and people in the music industry to think about. But before that, we've got two questions coming in. One from somebody called Jasper from Singapore. Jasper, hi there. Great to have you with us from Singapore. And from Candy Dell, Jasper wants to know, what about music on Twitch? Twitch, of course, is Amazon's game platform. And Candy wants to know, gaming is competition we are to deal with. The tech companies have collaboration with gaming folks to sell the bundle machines and accessories. Do you think we can bundle music with OTT platforms and a concert with a film or a concert with OTT? Will Twitch and music be much more of a coming thing?
Great. Jasper's question is absolutely on point. If I go back to who's winning during a crisis, gaming is winning. They're winning attention, which means everyone else has to be losing because attention is scarce. So that's a really, really good observation from Jasper. And I think what's very relevant here is the way that TikTok and Twitch, which have social interaction at the heart of their services, are beginning to move their way into the music business. You can see the hiring that's going on. A great way to know what a tech company is doing is look at its jobs board. Don't speculate through blogs, just look at who they're hiring. And if you look at the jobs pages of TikTok and Twitch, they're hiring music. So you've got gaming companies with social interaction at the heart moving into music. And then you have the incumbents, which for me look remarkably one-dimensional compared to these businesses who don't have social interaction but have music as a sort of their core proposition. And if you think about maximum minimum competition, why do we all speak English? Because it's the one language that offends the fewest people. So if you have social interaction moving into music, which doesn't have it, I'm very confident that those companies are going to go really far into the music business because they bring a network with them. You know, it's very interesting to think about, you know, the lack of social interaction that happens on Apple Music, Spotify, Deezer. You can't give comments. But these gaming businesses, they have social and they have attention. So I think it's going to be huge. I think if we did this seminar literally a year from now, the questions would be all about why is Twitch and why are TikTok winning? And I think it comes down to that. And then back to the second question there about bundling. Let's just remember that expression from Amazon, friction, kill it. Bundling kills friction. And I think it's been speculated in the media that Apple's looking at doing a super bundle where you just pay Apple a monthly fee for all of your books, all of your podcasts, all of your TV, and all of your music. I think there'll be more of that happening as well. So for those willing to pay, a great way to shore up their activity is to bundle it even further. And I think Apple's got a proposition coming down the pipe that will do that. That's been speculated in the media. But equally speculating with concert tickets as well, it could be a possibility too. My last point, we just think about the level of data we're getting back from this. You know, when I sold a CD to Ralph, nobody knew whether he listened to it, whether he listened to it more than once, whether he threw it in the trash can. Nobody knew. But the data that's coming in is making more bundling strategies more likely. So, you know, it's a bit of a curveball to throw at the audience here, but vinyl is growing like crazy. Vinyl overtake downloads in the UK this year, which is incredible, worth twice as much as YouTube to record labels this year. And paid streaming is growing, but it's the same people doing both. People are paying 120 quid a year to stream music and then going out and buying a vinyl record for 18 pounds, maybe 2, maybe 3. And I could see models in the future which say, pay this streaming fee and we will send you 3 records based on your listening behavior, or send you 3 concert tickets based on your listening behavior. And we'll just take care of all of the hassle of search and transaction that used to bug you. Friction, kill it. So if bundling can remove friction, bundling will find value.
Okay, so Will, here's an interesting question for you. You're in the UK, you're in London, but The UK has 3% of the world's population, and they sell 12% of the world's music revenues. The story for India, and to a certain extent China, but let's look at India because that's really our passion. The story for India is very different. The two most populous countries in the world, India and China, are not even in the same league table. Britain, 3% of the world population, 12% of the world's music sales. How do we change this?
Well, if I do the math in my head here, India and China combined make up about 2.5% of the global music industry's revenues, yet 25% of consumer demand, global GDP. So there's a big gap there, a factor of 10, obviously. And when you think about convergence, the question you're really asking is how soon and how fast will these two huge markets catch up with the rest? And that's going to be a challenging one. The work that I've been doing on this to date, and again, fingers crossed, tap wood, I can come to Mumbai to present, is to look at what we say in economics, and apologies for this jargon, non-linear breaks. So let's call them tipping points, which can happen in a growing emerging market. I like to call India a re-emerging market. It's re-emerging in its power. That can happen along the way. So at what level of income do Indian people start spending money on travel? There are points that you can study here which show that a certain level of wealth, a certain level of disposable income, and all of a sudden, a large swathe of the population will start spending money on travel. So for travel tech, that's a huge opportunity in that a large part of the population has suddenly tipped into addressable market for travel. And I think that type of work needs to be done on the Indian music industry. I would love to do it and present it with you, Ralph, later in the year in Mumbai, which is what are the tipping points which say we go? What are the tipping points which say all of a sudden less about free and more about paid in the Indian music industry? They will happen. We just need to do, roll up our sleeves and do the work to work out how they're going to happen. But I return back to the student population. It's just fascinating to think about the student population as a market opportunity for India. It's growing, is it 50 million, is it 100 million? But it's also growing in its addressable nature. More and more of those students will have smartphones, more and more of those students will have credit cards, more of those students will have money to spend on their education. And could there be a way in which the two could marry up, in which the willingness to spend on your education also bundles in the willingness to capture music as well?
Okay, Atul, any comments from you on that point?
Well, actually, of course, to me, it's always fascinating that, we have this great addressable population, and there's definitely going to be the kind of growth, the spurt in growth that we've been talking about for the last couple of years. But I always come back, being a good record label guy at heart, I always come back to, the question about when you bundle and you manage to achieve numbers, then within the bundle that goes out, how do you actually, evaluate the music part? Because there's games in there, there's movies in there, there's sports in there, and there's music. So how would that work? And in terms of the other three that I mentioned, sports, game, film, where does music come in? I mean, is it as valuable? Is it less valuable? Is it more valuable? So Will, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mentioned my favorite example of telco and media working together in the past, which was the KPN Spotify deal in the Netherlands. And I'm going to go back to that to answer your question, because there's an accountancy way of looking at it, the sort of looking down the columns of the numbers that are there, the margins that are available to both parties. But an economist has to abstract the situation and think, what is each party trying to achieve when you do a bundle? Now, back with KPN in 2011, 2012, the challenge they had was they were regarded as the sort of stodgy, old-fashioned monopoly telco in Holland. And what they wanted to do was change their brand. It had nothing to do with the value of music. Their objective was to change their brand. And you would know, Atul, there may be telcos in India which want to change their brand. So that when they wake up in the morning, that's their goal. And Spotify wanted to find scale, find people willing to pay for music that always has and always will be voluntary to pay for. So the two marry up with each other. And the point I want to make is Spotify achieved its goal. The biggest market outside Scandinavia back then was Holland. It's never stopped growing since. but KPN achieved its goal, which was that they succeeded in becoming a very hip, modern, student-friendly brand. These are two different conversations with two different languages, but they both found a way of working together. And I used to be a government economist, wearing a black suit, blue shirt, red tie, if you can imagine that. And I always remember a message that Gordon Brown, or Ralph would pronounce his name, Gordon Brune, told me, which is, he said to me,
right?
yeah, he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer for many years, then went on to become the Prime Minister and bankrupted our country, but that's a small detail. He was a good finance minister when he was involved in the numbers. But I remember when he was the Chancellor, the finance minister, he said this thing to me, he said, Will, why would you invest in a swimming pool? I was like, okay, well, I'd invest in a swimming pool because it employs some labor, it generates some economic activity and produces some tax revenue. That's why I'd use the public purse, the public money to invest in a swimming pool. So that's a terrible answer. The reason why you invest in a swimming pool is to reduce the health bill. I was like, got it. The objective of swimming pools was to reduce the cost of the NHS. If people are healthier, then they'll need less health care. I can spend more money on the NHS. That doesn't reduce the cost of the NHS. If I spend money on swimming pools, it might. And it's a great example of reading across the columns, not down them. So the purpose of KPN had nothing to do with the value of music. It had everything to do with the value of the brand. And that value of the brand could be worth way more than the unit value of copyright. So for people in your audience who are actively working on telco deals, I just ask you to remember that lesson I learned about swimming pools and the health service, which is to think about the objective that you're bundling with could be different from the one that you have yourself.
Okay, so now we've got an interesting question to ask you, which is going to be probably our last major question. Will, a lot of your career has been on identifying the export opportunity for music. And one of the good things about the export opportunity for music is it brings 4 words into music professionals that we like to show here today. Can you read what that says there?
Don't panic, don't panic.
Exactly. So if you've got bigger export, you certainly won't have to panic. But the thing is this, in 2011, you famously wrote a piece in The Economist that showed that there were 3 net exporters in the world, the US, the UK, and Sweden. And what we want to ask is this, could India become the 4th? And before you answer that question, Atul, we'd like to play a song that did really, really well in India, but it didn't translate, as, for example, that Latin American hit Despacito did, with various artists that had hits with it. But Despacito and Lamborghini, how many of you that are watching love that song, Lamborghini? Atul, quick word about Lamborghini.
Well, Lamborghini is actually a redone old folk song, which is a Punjabi folk song called Chitta Kukkad. Chitta Kukkad meaning white chicken, actually. Yeah. And it's become a song about a Lamborghini. So come on, let's roll the video.
Let's roll Lamborghini.
Lamborghini chalai jane o, Lamborghini chalai jane o, सानू भी चुटा दे दो किथे कल्ले कल्ले जाई जाने हो सानू भी चुटा दे दो किथे कल्ले कल्ले जाई जाने हो
Lamborghini she gets, and off they go. Okay, so what do you think of that, Paul? I don't know if you've seen that before, but obviously that's my car. You can see the sweater I'm wearing. Right. So here's the question, Will.
So just going back to the song, were the bagpipes going to come in a few seconds later, or?
Need some bagpipes maybe in that song. But Lamborghini never translated outside of India. Despacito translated all over the world, including in India. If you went to any pub or bar or student event, you would hear Despacito. Tell us a little bit about this whole issue of exports for Indian music and Indian talent. What are your thoughts?
Well, this is a passion of mine. I'm fascinated with this topic and have been for many years. I'll pay homage to the fantastic charity Doctors Without Borders. What I did was I coined an expression which was playlists without borders. The reckoning tree might be structured by country. Perhaps Atul works in India, Ralph works in London, and I work in New York, and we meet once a year at a company offsite. Consumers do not work like that. Consumers don't see these borders. And this is the big awakening for the global business, India especially. If we just go back to Despacito, what's been fantastic about our success in Latin America is that it's been so big that in Spain, they struggle to break Spanish acts because of the prominence of Latin Spanish-speaking music. So it just shows you that playlists don't have borders. You've got to get this mindset of these invisible lines out of your head, erase them, and understand consumers don't care where it's coming from. If they feel it, they get it, they latch onto it, they share it. So this is a really, really important point. Now, you asked a question, and it's great to hear you quote the Economist piece, 3 net exporters in the world: America, English-speaking; Britain, English-speaking, except the Scots, poor English, accept that; and then Sweden speak better English than the Scots do. Could India become a 4th? Let me just riff on this for a second and give the audience some understanding of what we're dealing with here. When Spotify hadn't launched in India, we used to ask the question, could Spotify break an Indian act? And the narrow-minded view would be, how can you? You've yet to launch in India yet. But wait, we have Indian repertoire on our service, a lot more now, and we can see where it's being consumed. And that allows you to understand where the diaspora, the expat populations
The NRI.
Yeah, the NRI. So that's a very, very important signal that potentially you could break an Indian act without being in India. Why not? There's Indians that are listening to Spotify around the world. Every other streaming service should be thinking like that. So I encourage that type of thinking across the business. So that's the first point. The second point is just to kind of get the scale of the expat population. And I'll give you an anecdote from Germany here. So we're going to go from London to Mumbai, back to Berlin. We did some work on Germany. I remember this well. And we worked out how many Germans are using Spotify in Berlin. And the answer was about 500,000. I'm just going to use round numbers here for non-disclosure. And then we asked, how many IP addresses are using Spotify in Berlin? And the answer was 1.5 million. Now, this is all quite a few years ago. I'm sure the numbers are way bigger now, but just hold that in your head. I got 500,000 Germans registered for Spotify in Berlin and 1.5 million IP addresses actively using Spotify in Berlin, which means 2 out of 3 Spotify users in Berlin are not German. Berlin is an international city full of young professionals and overseas students coming to study. They're coming with their original Spotify accounts and they keep on listening to music. And for me, it was like a penny dropped in my head of who's talking to them. The German music industry talks to the German market. The British music industry talks to the British market, but there's nobody in the British music industry talking to the hundreds of thousands of Brits living, working, studying in Berlin and enjoying music. So again, playlists don't have borders. It's a really big ask, but you've got to get those invisible lines out of our head and ask, who's talking to the Indian expat population around the world in terms of breaking acts there?
So here's a question from Ashish Perwani. Ashish, we are glad you're watching this. And your question is, so long as YouTube provide free music in India, will there ever be a willingness to pay for music streaming? And how will that, will YouTube perhaps help India and Indian writers and Indian music to expand internationally?
So it's a great point. For my forthcoming book that I'm working on just now, I coined this term fake scale. And what that refers to is I could come up to a young, talented millennial like Ralph Simon, who's in his 20s, and say, Ralph, here's a big chunk of change, a big checkbook for you, and I'm going to make you huge in America. And what we started to see, thanks to YouTube's global reach, it is literally everywhere. The World Wide Web does not stand for the UK Wide Web. It does not stand for the India Wide Web. The first W stands for world. Is people are rejecting those offers because they want global reach. So the fantastic thing with YouTube there is it has global reach. So, 240 million users within India. I'm sure that number is a lot bigger now. But just imagine how many Indians expats are using YouTube outside of India that could tap into that. And then you're going to get some very interesting network effects as the music exports out. But just to reiterate, the playlists don't have borders. If that Lamborghini tune chimes with a whole global population, then it's going to travel far faster than the industries, which are contained by borders, could ever have made it happen. So it's user-generated content.
Atul, we've had a question from Ashok Parwani when we spoke about Lamborghini. He asks, can Kolavari, that big hit song, the first Indian viral song, could that go across borders? What do you think, Atul?
Well, that's a great example, Ralph, because it traveled, it's in Tamil, and it traveled across India, which doesn't speak Tamil. So I think we've already done it in some way. We just now need to move outside the borders of India, as Will was saying, and get into international markets.
And do we have the executives in India, creatives in India that can create Indian music that can travel the world, not just like A.R. Rahman did, thanks to his incredible musical brilliance and his film work, but does the Indian creative community and Indian professionals have the ability to make music for a global audience?
Most certainly. And, we tend to look first at Bollywood, and then we look at the other other language film industries in India. But, there are so many talented guys over there. And in fact, there are very, very talented music composers and producers who have had successes in Bollywood, who are now going out and doing non-film music. People like Salim Suleiman. There's Vishal Dadlani, Shekhar, so all the boys, Shankar Ehsaan Loy, they're big names, but they're going out and exploring independent music, non-film music, because that's where their heart is. And they are fantastic musicians, make no doubt about it.
So, Will, we unfortunately are, the clock has hit us, but of course, bearing in mind this sign that we want to show people, when you think of India and Indian music, would you agree that this is the right statement to make, Atul and Will?
Plus one.
Absolutely. And I think there are some very good takeaways from what Will has told us today, Ralph. The first being, of course, that learn to hold hands after this pandemic. Let each one look at each other's business and their interests, hold hands. Don't get too firm and rigid about your valuations. They will come. India seems to be a great opportunity at the moment, thanks to the young population, thanks to the education, the penetration, and the number of services that we have. Right. And of course, we've got this huge 30 million plus diaspora sitting outside India, which is a boon for any artist making music today. And if I've left anything out?
Just one last point there. What we've seen in Latin America with the growth of streaming, paid streaming there, is as their music exports to richer countries, richer royalties are flowing back to the original markets. That's an income effect. So 1,000 streams in America could be worth the same as 10,000 streams in Brazil. So that's one consideration. And then back to the woman who asked a question about gaming and bundling earlier on as well. I am absolutely convinced that within a year's time, the entire conversation will have pivoted, the name of my forthcoming book, pivoted towards an Indian song being used in a computer game and achieving global success. And that was the channel in which they managed to capture their reach as well. So I really do believe that there's a day of reckoning happening where games are winning attention and they're moving into music and they're not going to move away. So, I believe in a year's time that will dominate the dialogue that we'll be having.
Well, unfortunately, we've been beaten by the clock, but we've got hopefully a lot of ideas. All those of you all across India, everywhere in India, that have been watching and listening to this, we hope it's given you some ideas, maybe some new melodic ideas to come up with a song that will really triumph. And of course, to all of the international viewers and watchers and listeners, including people in Singapore, in Australia, all over North America, Europe, thanks so much for listening. All About Music digital sessions, proving that this is really where it's at. Atul, to you, thank you so much for your wisdom, your great knowledge, and of course, just pulling all of this stuff together for All About Music. To Will, especially for you, we feel the only appropriate thing we can do to close this session is to once again go to that great video of the Scottish Punjabi music or Punjabi Scottish music, which is created by Archie J. even though it's the act is called Snake Charmer, but Archie J in Delhi. Archie J, thanks so much for letting us play your music today. We will close out on that. Will, final comment from you, the Scottish Punjabi, honorary Scottish Punjabi.
I just reiterate, playlists don't have borders, and the opportunity in India is huge, but do not let that put blinkers on everyone listening to this conference call today. The opportunity to reach the expat population is potentially even bigger. So please do not discuss borders when you discuss music.
Atul, final comments from you.
Well, I just want to say thank you. It's been a real pleasure and honor to have you here, Will. And thank you, Ralph, for actually putting this together. You are a master curator when it comes to All About Music and the digital sessions. We could never do this without your help. So thank you so much, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
So let's go to the videotape and let's get a little bit of